And a very good evening to everybody. Just waiting for a few people to come in now. Good evening, welcome to Lansdowne here at Woodbury Avenue. Hope you've had a good day and that you've enjoyed all the cakes, teas and coffees. Thank you to Nikki and the team for putting on what is always a fantastic spread. So thank you, but there will be more later, so hopefully you can enjoy that. So this evening is, once again, for those that have been here, it's a slightly different format, the Big Questions format. And it's the fifth in the series of Big Questions. Michael's going to speak and then do some question and answers, so an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you may have. Any sort of questions that you're unsure of or that you really would like to ask around the subject area. So a great opportunity for you. The subject tonight is, isn't faith just a crutch for the weak or a virus of the mind? So there's an interesting one for Michael, following on from some of the previous ones. So the format for the evening, Michael's going to speak for about 30 minutes. And after Michael's talk, there'll be a 5-minute gap. Opportunities for you to either text questions to the number on the screen or to actually write on your chairs. You've got a feedback form, but a place where you can put questions and write them, and we'll come and collect them from you. Following that, we'll put the questions into a sequence, and I'll ask them to put them to Michael, and Michael will hopefully be able to respond and really give good answers to the questions that you may have. Obviously, we can't answer everything, or perhaps as fully as you want, so opportunities to then explore that a little bit later. But before we start, though, Michael, do you want to come on up? And I think you've got to. Do you want to stand that side so you don't get a shadow? There you go. Don't want the shadows up here. So a special day or a special time, actually, because Michael's actually written his third book of the trilogy, entitled "But Is It True?" And this follows on from the first two books that he did, "What Kind of Hope?" and "What Kind of God?" the first one, "What Kind of Hope?" the second one, and "But Is It True?" the third one. So it's really sort of asking Michael. I mean, if the quote that we've got on here is that "But Is It True?" provides honest answers to honest questions raised by those trying to discern if the message of Jesus Christ is true and defensible. So there's a lot within it, but I'd just like to ask Michael a few questions now on it. Firstly, where do you start when you write a book? Where do you know how to write the first word? That must be the challenge.
Well, the introduction is always the last thing I write, actually. So they always say, write the beginning of the book at the end, because you know how you want to start it. But actually, all the books started as talks that I gave. Some of you will know that I speak a lot in universities in different contexts around Europe. And so all of them began life as talks to university students primarily. And then from that, I then decided to kind of take the talks and put them into book form. It was good doing it that way because actually you get to see how people are kind of responding, and you also get to hear people's questions off the back of what you're saying. So hopefully you can kind of incorporate those subsequent questions into the chapters. So yeah, it was talks that then kind of grew, and eventually there were enough, and they kind of fitted together on the theme.
So how many words in there?
I think it's about 50,000 in that
50,000 words.
Yeah.
Now, we know students who have to do their dissertations with 10,000 words, freaking out, writing that so many. So 50,000 words, and longer than the previous two.
So it's a bit longer in length. Took probably twice as long to write as the others. So yeah, it's I kind of started a couple of years ago and thought, oh, this will be easy. And then I kind of, as it went on, thought this is taking longer than I expected. I think partly because of the nature of the content in the book. So because of the nature, it's talking about truth, talking about truth claims. You want to make sure that all the claims that you're making are objectively true. So kind of checking things, double-checking things. it kind of covers areas like history and philosophy and sociology and psychology. I'm blessed to have friends who are cleverer than me in all of those areas, so sending it off to a professor of history to double check all the claims and stuff like that.
So a lot of scrutiny.
So yeah, really, because people will read it with scrutiny, and you want to make sure that you're absolutely right in the things that you're claiming.
Yeah. And what about the sequence? Because obviously, what kind of God, what kind of hope, but is it true? Is there any logic to the sequence with which you've followed through?
Not a massive amount, other than that was the order I gave the talks. So I started by giving a series of talks really on the moral objections to God, the What Kind of God book. Then I did a series of talks which kind of worked in that. And then I guess what this was to be a kind of sequel to the first, really. It's quite similar in style in that they both seek to answer questions, but just different types of questions.
So going on from that, if we've got friends who are searching, really exploring about the Christian faith, or a help to us who are perhaps sharing our faith with others, which book would you go for?
No. I'm sure we can do you a special deal, 3 for the price of 4 or something like that. So,
and all royalties go to Moe,
yeah,
the Michael Ox Evangelism Trust.
So seriously, the difference between What Kind of God and this one is that What Kind of God is looking at the moral objections that people have. Really what I'm trying to say is there are 2 types of questions you might have about the Christian faith. Questions about whether it's good and questions about whether it's true. And so the first book was seeking to look at those moral objections, questions like suffering, hell, sexuality, other religions. How can God be good in the light of those type of questions? And then this book is looking more at the truth claims. How can Christianity be true if science has buried God, if faith is just a crutch, if the resurrection never happened, and so forth?
Yeah.
And so if your questions or your friends' questions are kind of moral objections, then What Kind of God would be the type of book. If they're more intellectual questions about whether they can know it would be true, then this is probably more up their streets. What Kind of Hope, the book in the middle, was really trying to look at the whole kind of Bible story, the Bible worldview, and say, how does this hope that Jesus offers make a difference to life now? It's not just pie in the sky when you die. It's something that really does change your life here and now.
So very different between the 3 books.
Yeah.
And lastly, what encouragement that you perhaps didn't foresee when you wrote the books? What's an encouragement that you've had?
Well, I've obviously raked in millions of pounds, so the yacht down at Sandbanks is coming. No. I think the biggest encouragement from writing the book is reading messages. Occasionally you get an email from someone that you've never met, some part of the world, who said, I got given your book, or I bought your book in an airport or something, and it's really helped me. I got an email from someone who was in the Far East, just saying, I've just read your book, and I've come to know Jesus as a result of reading it. And really that's why I've written them. I want people to see that the gospel is good, that it's true, and that it's relevant. And so if it helps people to faith in Jesus, or if it strengthens their faith in Jesus, then that's really what I'd love to see.
Brilliant. And Michael, as many of you are aware, heads up the Moe Trust, Michael Ox Evangelism Trust, and goes out and speaks to universities and various other locations. So just back from a couple of weeks in St Andrews and York University, haven't you? So we'll leave it to you. So you're going to speak on,
Fantastic.
Isn't faith just a crutch for the weak or a virus of the mind? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, we are going to look at this question tonight. And as Pete said earlier, you'll have an opportunity to text in your questions as we go through. So unlike normal, make sure your phone is on, and then you can be texting in as we go through, and we'll have some time at the end to look at those questions. But really, we're looking at 2 arguments today against the Christian faith, one from psychology and the other from sociology. If those words confuse you, don't worry, we'll kind of show it in a much more popular level as well. But firstly, the idea that faith is just a crutch, a psychological crutch. It's just wishful thinking. Maybe you've heard people say, or maybe you've said yourself, well, you only believe in Christianity because you want it to be true, because it gives you comfort, because it's nice to believe. It's just a crutch. It's just wish fulfillment. And this idea that faith is just a crutch for the weak is really illustrated in a film called The Invention of Lying. Now, Ricky Gervais is the lead actor and the director of the film. And if any of you know anything about Ricky Gervais, the one thing you probably know about him is that he's an atheist. And if you follow him on Twitter, it kind of comes across rather clearly. And his atheism really comes through clearly in the plot line and the story of the film. He plays the lead character called Mark. And Mark lives in a world where nobody can lie. Everybody has to tell the truth. No one knows what a lie is, apart from him. Because he has developed somehow the ability to tell lies in a world where no one else can. And he discovers that this ability to tell lies is actually quite useful. He can walk into a bank and convince the bank manager to give him lots of money just because he says to the bank manager, "I have got lots of money." And the bank manager believes him. He can convince a beautiful girl to go on a date with him because he tells her, "I am a beautiful man," and she believes him. And so you can have all sorts of fun in a world where people will believe whatever you say, until he comes to a more serious moment in the film when his mum is dying in hospital. And he's seeking to try and comfort his mum as she faces the prospect of death, and in her belief system, nothing beyond. So we're going to watch a short clip now from the film that illustrates what he says. Remember the context. He's living in a world where no one can lie, but he can. And listen to what he says. The point that he's making through the whole scene is this: that's just a lie. This belief that you die and go to a nice place one day, it's just wishful thinking. It was just a lie invented to make people feel better. Well, as the story of the film progresses, news about this happy place that you go to when you die spreads all over the world. And people start to ask this guy, Mark, how you get to the happy place and what you must do to be sure that you get there. And so we'll see another short clip now where he goes outside the hospital to meet the crowds who have gathered to hear about this news and see what he tells them about how you can get to the place in the sky. The rules, and you get to go to the good place in the sky when you die. Faith, it's just a crutch. It's just something for the weak. Now, actually, Ricky Gervais isn't the first to suggest that idea. The idea's been around for at least a couple of hundred years. The first person to kind of describe it was this guy, Ludwig Feuerbach. The philosopher. And he said, God is the highest subjectivity of man abstracted from himself. He was just a creation of our own thinking, our own subjective minds. But if you haven't heard of him, you've probably heard of this chap, Sigmund Freud's. Many of his ideas have been discredited, although this idea persists to today. And he said this: religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. Thus, the benevolent rule of the divine providence allays our fears of the dangers of life. In other words, what he's saying is we have all these fears and worries, and so we create a God who can deal with our fears and deal with our worries. He says God is like a divine father figure, a kind of father figure that we project into the heavens. We like our fathers, so we create a heavenly father to give us comfort when our earthly fathers can no longer give it to us. And the idea is still popular today in certain people's minds. Derren Brown, the illusionist, said this about his early life as actually a believing Christian, he would say. He said, I just believed because I had always done and because it had come to be a very important psychological crutch. So he says, look, I've grown up now. I don't need that psychological crutch anymore. It was just a wish fulfillment. So is faith just a crutch? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is this: is faith just a virus of the mind? The argument popularly is basically this: you only believe what you believe because you were born in the country where you were, or the family that you were born into. And so because you were born into a Christian country or into a Christian family, then of course you believe the things that your parents and your culture believed. But it's just a virus. It's just something you catch from those around you. Now, someone who articulated this a little bit more was Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins took the idea of faith as being like a meme. He coined the term meme to be a bit like a gene. It's deliberately similar. And he says, just as genes are bits of biological information that are passed on from your parents, so memes are ideas that are passed on from your parents and your culture that replicate in your mind, in your thinking. Memes affect the way we think, just as genes affect the physical way we are. And he says this, faith is one of the great evils compared to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. And who looking at Northern Ireland or the Middle East can be confident, it should say, that the brain virus of faith is not exceedingly dangerous. So he says faith, belief in God, it's just a meme that's been passed down, just like our genes have been passed down, and we need to try and eradicate it. And so he famously brought out this range of clothing with the phrase, religion, together we can find the cure. Because if religion and belief in God is just a virus, then what do you do with it? Well, you treat it just as you treat a virus. So is faith just a crutch, wish fulfillment? Is faith just a virus, something you catch from being born into a certain culture or a certain family? Well, you probably aren't surprised to think I think the answer is no. You probably would be surprised if I thought the answer was anything but no. But let me try and explain why I think that is the case. Let's look at this together. Firstly, and we'll look at these arguments together, the arguments, both that faith is a crutch and that faith is a virus, can cut both ways. Actually, it's worth thinking through any objection to the Christian faith and thinking, initially at least, could this argument work against itself? And I think in this case it can. You see, it's very possible to say, well, you only believe in God because you want to believe in God. But equally, of course, you could turn it around and say, but you don't believe in God because you don't want to believe in God. Just as faith could be a wish fulfillment, so my atheism could be a wish fulfillment as well, couldn't it? In fact, Richard Dawkins came out recently and said, faith is just a fairy story for those who are afraid of the dark. And John Lennox, the Christian professor, was asked by the media to respond to it, and he said, yes, and atheism is a fairy story for those who are afraid of the light. See, the argument can cut both ways. You just turn it straight round on itself. Now, you might say, well, no one would not believe in God because they don't want to. But actually, there are at least some atheists that are willing to admit that that is the case. Listen to what Aldous Huxley said. He said, I had a motive for not wanting the world to have a meaning. He was an atheist. Consequently, I assumed that it had none. For myself, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation, sexual and political. It was convenient not to believe in God, and so I didn't. Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy, said, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope there is no God. Isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope there is no God. I hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. He says, look, actually I don't want there to be a God, and I'm quite content with that philosophy. Why? Because actually if there is no God, it's quite convenient, isn't it? Dostoevsky famously said, if God does not exist, then everything is permissible. So maybe we could say that it's atheism that's the wish fulfillment. At least the argument can cut both ways in that way. And actually, just as you might argue that people believe in God because they want to replicate the positive experiences of their father, could atheism be a way of escaping God because of the negative experiences of their father? There's a Christian psychiatrist who says this, Paul Vitz. He wrote a book called Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism. And he looked at some of the most famous atheists through history, and he said in every single case we find that there was an absence or an abusive father in their situation. So perhaps we could argue that it's a rejection of their negative experiences of fatherhood. At very least, what we have to say is this, that we're not just kind of brains who walk around on legs making rational statements, but the things that we believe are affected by what we want to be true. They're affected by our desires, not just our rationality. I mean, give you a silly illustration. I know that salad is healthier for me than steak, okay? But I still eat steak because I like it more, okay? So sometimes we can know what is true, but it doesn't always affect what we decide to go through on, what the decisions that we make. What about the argument, though, that faith is just a virus? It's just something you catch from your environment? Well, again, actually, we have to say that that can cut both ways, can't it? You could say, well, you're just a Christian because you were born in Britain. But actually, think about it. Britain, particularly amongst my generation, is more popular to be an atheist than it is to be a Christian. So how do we know that actually people aren't just atheists because they're following the general trends of society or culture? Just as someone might be a Christian because their parents are Christians, how do we know that someone might not just be an atheist because they're following what their parents believed? Again, it just cuts both ways. Here's a second problem with this idea, though, the idea that faith is just a crutch and that faith is just a virus. And that is that when you say that, you undermine the very concept of truth. You see, when you say that our beliefs are not just affected by our thinking, and not just affected by our culture, but they are caused by our psychological state or by our culture, then actually you have to say, shouldn't that be true for all beliefs? Why is that only true for belief in God or belief in Christianity? Why is that not also true for every belief, including this belief and including atheism as well? And that's actually the problem with Richard Dawkins' idea about memes. When he says that our beliefs are just memes that are passed down from society, then you have to actually think all beliefs are, including atheism, and actually including memes themselves. All of those beliefs just get explained away. But actually, he would want to say that they're true. There's another problem, actually, with the idea of memes, and that is that in terms of intellectual circles, the idea has been really discredited. There was a journal set up, the Journal of Memetics, to look at this idea that Dawkins had introduced. And it closed down a few years ago, and in the final online journal, the final article concluded with these words: "The concept of memes," it said, "had been a short-lived fad whose effect has been to obscure than it had been to enlighten. I'm afraid that memetics as an identifiable discipline will not be widely missed." In other words, it doesn't really work. Now, to illustrate why this undermines itself, I want to show you another short video clip. This is of John Cleese, who is, as far as I know, not a Christian, but illustrates how when you start to explain everything away in this manner, you end up explaining away the very explanation. So let's have a little look at what he has to say. You explain everything away, and you end up speaking, well, nonsense. So when we use these ideas to undermine religion, we don't just undermine religion and undermine God, we undermine truth itself. I remember speaking at a philosophy class local to here a couple of years ago, and we were discussing this idea that faith is just a meme. And this lady said to me, "Well, why are you so angry about the idea of memes?" She says, "Why are you so upset? Is it because you think it undermines your belief in God?" I said, "No, I think it because it undermines this whole class. Because if we can explain away all beliefs as memes, then why are we even discussing the idea of truth?" So it undermines truth. Actually, beyond that, I want to say it can also be quite dangerous. You see, if you start believing that faith is just a virus, then the way you engage with people you disagree with is not through rational dialogue, because actually you no longer think that this person is a rational person. Actually, you start to treat them. Actually, this is what's been suggested by this guy, Peter Boghossian. He talks himself up as a street epistemologist. I think in common terms, you could say he's an atheist evangelist. And he says this. He said, "We must reconceptualize faith as a virus of the mind and treat faith like other epistemological crises, contain and eradicate." He says we need to actually eradicate faith. We need to get rid of it because it's dangerous. Now you might say, well, that's a kind of extreme view, and it is an extreme view, and certainly not all atheists are suggesting that. But It's not without precedence, because that kind of thing was exactly the thinking behind much of what happened in the Soviet Union over the last century, as they sought to eradicate religion from society. And that wasn't just a benign idea. Within 5 years of the Russian Revolution, 2,500 priests were killed, 1,900 monks, 3,000 nuns. Why? Because faith was seen as a virus, something that was dangerous. I was in Albania just last year, the only country on earth that had an atheistic constitution, as they systematically closed down and eradicated every religious place of worship during the communist period there. So when we start making claims like this, we might say, well, they're just ideas, but they have serious consequences potentially. So it undermines truth. But here's the third thing I want to say about the idea faith is just a crutch or a virus, and that is that all our desires can't be wrong. In fact, it would be impossible for all the desires of all people in the world to be wrong at the same time. So just because you desire something to be true doesn't automatically mean it isn't true. In fact, you might want to turn it around and say, if you desire something, it might be because such a thing exists. Listen to how C.S. Lewis put it so lucidly. He said, the Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire for which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. See, what Lewis is saying is not that everybody experiences the fulfillment of their desires, but if we have a universal desire, surely it reflects to something which is real. And interestingly, despite the greatest attempts of some cultures in history, there's never been a culture that's been completely atheistic. There is this sense of something more, something divine, but why? Well, one author in the Old Testament put it this way. They said, God has placed eternity on our hearts. Why do we desire God? Well, if God created us, could it not be possible that God created us with a desire to know him, to be connected to him? Augustine, the famous church leader of the early church, said this, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Pascal, the great French mathematician, put it this way, what else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in a man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are. Those, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can only be filled with an infinite and immutable object. In other words, by God himself. See, what Pascal is saying is that actually we have that desire, that yearning for God, because we were made that way. We were made to know God, to be connected to him, to have a relationship with him. So rather than pretending that the desire is just some pipe dream, maybe we should examine whether that desire is related to reality. The last thing I would say in response to this argument is this, that although we might think that faith is just a crutch or a virus, the reality of what we see is quite different. You see, it's not borne out in experience. You see, if faith is just a crutch for weak people, then you would expect the only people who become Christians to be weak, vulnerable people who want to make their life better. But for a start, for many Christians, possibly most Christians in the world today, becoming a Christian doesn't make their life easier now. Actually, for many Christians in the world, becoming a Christian is really tough. Think of the 147 Christians in Kenya last year, gunned down because of their faith in Jesus. Was faith just a crutch for them? The Independent last year ran a report on Christians as the most persecuted people on earth. 100,000 Christians a year killed because of their faith in Jesus. Is faith just a crutch for them? It sounds rather shallow, doesn't it, to say faith is just a crutch, when for many people, actually it takes great strength to follow Jesus. And actually in our culture today, I think it takes far more courage at least to be a public Bible-believing Christian than it would be to reject it all as a load of rubbish. It's not just a crutch. In fact, if you want to become a true rebel and a countercultural person in our society, become an evangelical Christian. You will get mocked for it. It's not just a crutch. And it's not just that people become Christians because they want it to be true. Some people come to Christ because they have a great sense of need and desire, but not for everyone. That certainly wasn't the case for the Apostle Paul, one of the early Christian leaders in the New Testament. He was a persecutor of the Christian faith. And yet something happened to transform his life so he might proclaim the very faith that he once persecuted. And yet he certainly didn't want it to be true. Nor did C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, for much of his life, an atheist. Eventually, when he became convinced of the truth of the Christian faith and God's existence, he says in his autobiography, "I knelt by my bed in Oxford and admitted that God was God, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." He said he didn't believe it because he wanted it to be true. Actually, he didn't want it to be true because he knew it would have a serious implication. He believed it, though, because he thought it was true. And also, if you're only a Christian because you're born in a Christian country or you're born in a Christian family, what are we to say for all those who've come to Christ who weren't born in a Christian country or in a Christian family? In fact, the whole entire first generation of Christians were neither born in a Christian country nor were in a Christian family. The same is true for some of you here who know Jesus. And actually, around our world today, Christianity is growing most rapidly, not in countries that are regarded as Christian. Where is Christianity growing most rapidly? In countries like China and Nepal and Mongolia and Algeria and Iran and Afghanistan. And in many of these countries, they have not come to Christ because their parents were. For many of them are first-generation Christians, but they've come to Jesus because they think that it's true. See, the idea that faith is just a virus of the mind or a crutch for the weak isn't borne out in experience, in reality. See, ultimately, the problem with both of these ideas is this: that psychology and sociology will give you a very good explanation for why people believe in God if there is no God, but they provide you with an equally good explanation for why people don't believe in God if there isn't a God. But what they won't ever tell you is whether or not there is a God. For that, you actually need to look at the evidence and investigate it for yourself. So what I want to do is invite Canarik to come and join me. If you were here in our service this morning, you'll have met Canarik a little bit, but I want to ask her some different questions tonight about how she came to become a Christian. Because Canarik, you're from
Armenia.
Armenia.
Yeah.
Now, actually, Armenia is a Christian country historically. It was the first country in the world.
Yes, since 301, Armenia accepted Christianity as a state religion. So from that time until now, we have been a Christian country. Just these 70 years of being in Soviet Union, we were an atheistic country.
Yeah. So historically, it's been a Christian country, but your
Yes.
family was not a Christian family growing up.
No, because both my parents were brought up in communist country, so they got this atheistic education.
So many of the people who grew up in that communist time
Yes.
reflected the kind of atheistic ideas,
Yes.
including your parents.
Yes.
So what would you have believed then growing up?
It was somehow ridiculous to believe in something that you don't see and don't touch, but as a teenager, it's interesting. Maybe there is someone over there.
Okay, but generally you just thought maybe this is just a fanciful idea.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you don't think that anymore. I hope not, because you're working with me speaking at university events around Britain. So you don't think that way anymore. What changed?
Yes.
Why did you think that actually it might be more than you thought?
Yes, you're right. So I changed my mind some 10 years ago. And the main reason was that I was 15 and I started to read a book about Christianity. And it was a book by a Christian apologist, and he was talking about Jesus, about his life, about some facts to prove the resurrection of Jesus. So this book was very interesting, and it could convince me that there is someone over there, and that it's true that Jesus is a God.
Okay, so you came to believe Christianity was true, not because your parents did, because they didn't,
Sure.
but because you actually looked at the evidence and started to investigate it for yourself.
Yes.
And as you looked at the evidence, you found it compelling, convincing.
Yes, the evidences were really reasonable. So I was a teenager, but I could understand quite a lot. So I started to investigate more and more, reading more books, searching for more evidences, and also trying to meet some Christians and trying to know from the first hand.
Brilliant. But being a Christian is more than just intellectual kind of assents of some facts, isn't it?
Yes.
It's more than that. So what happened when you actually thought that Christianity might be true? What did you do about it?
So this idea that God is alive, so that I was convinced that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and so I knew that he was alive, and his promises in the Bible that he's alive and he's with me forever until the end of the time. So it gave me this belief that I should start having a relationship with him because he's with me and he wants to have friendship with me and he wants to love me and he wants to take care of me and he's my father, he's my friend, and I don't have to reject him.
Fantastic. So you wouldn't say that faith was just a crutch, but actually it has given you a great sense of being loved by God.
Sure, I have always been a strong girl, so I've never been a weak one that needed some crutch or something.
Fantastic. And it has changed. In what way has it changed your life?
It gave me more confidence. That I'm loved, and it helped me to trust God that is sovereign, that is with me, that loves me. Yeah, in many ways, it changed all my life, actually. It's still changing. It just didn't happen in 1 minute. It's still going on. It's an ongoing process.
Brilliant.
Yeah, every day I try to discover more about Jesus and God, and I'm so happy that I know him and he knows me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So actually for Canarik, her story is not that she just believed it because her family did or because she wanted to, but because she discovered it was true. And if you're here and you're saying, well, I don't know whether it's true, our big encouragement to you would be to investigate, actually start to look at the evidence. Look particularly at the person of Jesus. Look particularly at the evidence for the resurrection. That's the last chapter in my book, because it's the most important thing of all. Is it just a crutch? No, it's not just a crutch. But actually what I want to say is this. It's not just a crutch, but that doesn't mean it's not a crutch. Now, what do I mean by that? Faith isn't just a crutch that that fulfills our wishes, but if you broke your leg, you would like a crutch, wouldn't you? A crutch would be very useful. If something is broken, it needs to be fixed. Jesus said this on one occasion. He said, "It's not the healthy that need the doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call righteous, but sinners to repentance." See, Jesus was saying actually that all of us in one sense need not just a crutch because we have a broken leg, but we need even more than that. He says there's something broken about us, not just physically, but internally, spiritually, emotionally. That because all of us have cut ourselves off from God, we're in a desperate situation now, heading towards an ultimately desperate situation in the future. And Jesus says, I have come to be the one to mend what was broken. I've come not just to be a crutch, but I've come to be a rescuer. To rescue you from the problem of your own sin and rejection of God. To rescue you from that sin that would cut you off from God now and ultimately. I've come to mend what was broken. I've come to bring you back to the God who made you and loved you. See, faith is not just a crutch, but it's far more than that. If the Christian faith is true, it says that there is a God who loves you personally, intimately, and can rescue you and be with you through life and into eternity. Not too good to be true, so good because it is true, and it can be for all of us. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to pause for a couple of minutes. There's going to be an opportunity to do two things. Firstly, the opportunity to text your questions if you've not already. And you can do that to the number that's on the screen, or you can write it on the end of this piece of paper here. Text your questions, write them down. But also, we'd love to hear back from you about these events. It's really helpful as we do them each month to know ideas and thoughts. And so you can write down any comments on the other side. There's a little kind of feedback form. And if you're here and you're saying, well, I'd like to find out more about this. Maybe I'm not convinced yet about this, but I kind of want to investigate. And what we're saying is that's a really good thing to do. Don't just write this off, but investigate for yourself. Then leave your details at the bottom, and we'll be able to get in touch with you and let you know about some things happening here at the church that might be really helpful for you. Okay? We're not going to stick your name on any contact mailing lists for the rest of your life, don't worry, but we will let you know about stuff that might be helpful for you. Okay? So take 3 minutes now to fill it out. You can chat to your neighbor. We haven't got to sit in silence. There'll be a little bit of music. And then we'll take about 10 minutes or so after that to respond to some of those questions before we wrap up. And there'll be more coffee and cake at the end. So get away texting, and we'll come back in a moment.
We've just got a couple of minutes to go before we start doing the question and answers. If anybody's got a question, could you just hold it up so that stewards can come and collect it off you? If there are any further questions to come, thank you. Okay, we've a good number of questions that have come in, so hopefully Michael is ready and raring to go. Okay, first question. So why Christianity? Why not another monotheistic faith, or even worship the sun or Mother Earth? Your rationale for God is compelling, but which is right?
Yeah, good question. So one of the things I said is that throughout history, there's never been a purely atheistic or materialistic culture. There's always been the sense of something divine or something more, but that doesn't mean that every culture is Christian. There are all sorts of different ideas about religion. And my point in saying that there is some idea of God within all cultures is that actually if there is a God who created the world, that's not surprising, that there is some kind of yearning for God. But obviously it doesn't mean that all our ideas about God are equally true. And actually, rationally, as we start to think about that, it would be quite hard for them all to be equally true because they're not fundamentally the same. Actually, they have quite different claims about what God is like. So how do we choose, therefore, which path or which idea of God is right? I think one of the unique things about Christianity is that Christianity says that we're not simply guessing at what God is like, kind of our ideas as human beings looking at God, but actually we believe that God has revealed himself and revealed himself in person. So it's not so much that we're trying to work our way to God, but God has revealed himself to us. And actually, think about it logically. If God really does exist and is, as the Bible says he is, the creator of us and the whole world, how would we ever know anything about God unless God did reveal himself? You know, it's a bit like, how would an ant ever know anything about me? Beyond the ant's experience, unless I became an ant, as it were, and walked into its world. And that's what the Bible says God has done in the person of Jesus. He's revealed himself in person in history, and so we can know what he's like. And that's a bigger claim than that's made about other big religious leaders. He's not just a prophet pointing to God. Yeah. He's God walking into this world, revealing himself. So I think that would be the nature of the claim that Jesus makes about himself. Puts Christianity as unique. Obviously, the question you want to ask beyond that is, well, can I believe this claim? Can I believe that it's true? And that's where you want to look at the evidence for the Gospels, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, because that's the thing that would vindicate or undermine the claims he makes. But if they are true, then actually you've got something that is quantifiably above and beyond all other claims that have been made.
Because Jesus claimed he was God, it's the starting point almost, isn't it, on your search for who God is.
Well, in one sense, yes, because he's making the biggest claim of all.
I think you said you've got to discount Christianity first, if that's your starting point.
Yeah.
You know, and hopefully you won't when you do look into the claims and the truth that is there, but definitely the starting point.
Great.
Thank you. Number 2, why is God good to know in the hard times of life?
And why is God good to know in the hard times of life? I guess partly, number 1, because we all have hard times in life. That's the reality of the world we live in. The Bible says we live in a good world because it's created by God, but it's a broken world, it's gone wrong, and the reality is all of us will experience difficulty because of that. Where will we turn? I find it interesting because I spend a lot of time talking to students who sometimes, well, all of them are quite young, and sometimes have never experienced much of life, and so they can say things like, well, I've got no interest in Christianity, it's got nothing to offer me, it's irrelevant and everything else. And I say, well, your philosophy works now in the lecture room in a fairly sheltered experience, but does it work in the realities of life? Does your philosophy of life work in the reality of suffering? You might just say, well, this is just the way the world is, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. But when it's actually things that are personal to you, that does make you ask questions in a different kind of way. So I would say you want a belief system that works not just in theory, but also in practice through the tough times of life. And I'd say knowing Jesus is something that has actually stood the test of time for many. And many here in this church who can say, actually, God has been there with me through the hard times.
A God who loves us. If the expert atheists, expert in inverted commas, want to eradicate faith, what do they think they're offering that's so great instead? Why is atheism so appealing? Do you think agnosticism is more prevalent nowadays? 2 for 1.
Is agnosticism more prevalent? Well, I haven't done a survey, although it's interesting. Obviously, you get some people say, I'm definitely an atheist, I definitely don't believe God exists. Other people are agnostic. In one sense, if there was no evidence either way, agnosticism would be the kind of logical conclusion. One philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, put it this way. He said, look, you cannot prove that there are an even number of stars in the universe, but just because you cannot prove there are an even number of stars doesn't mean you should assume that there is an odd number. You should just assume we don't know. And so sometimes people say, well, you can't prove God exists, therefore atheism. And I say, well, no, actually, the logical conclusion is if you can't prove God exists, agnosticism, potentially, would be the option. And that's why we do need to look at the evidence either way. Where does the evidence lead us to? And I think actually there is plenty of evidence that can point us towards the existence of God, the fact of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the fact of moral values, and in particular the person of Jesus, are all things that we need to look into and find an explanation for.
So is there a great deal of difference between atheism and agnosticism? Or is it just a state that people choose one or the other, but really?
Well, in one sense, I mean, Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous atheist, would actually say, well, I'm not 100% atheist because I can't absolutely prove that God doesn't exist. I'm 99 point whatever percent. So I guess there are degrees on that scale, aren't there? And I would say, if you don't look at the evidence, then agnosticism could be a kind of logical conclusion. But kind of being open-minded about it, whilst it sounds good, is good to an extent, but ultimately, when you do look at the evidence, you do need to make a decision. I think C.S. Lewis said, the purpose of an open mind is the same as an open mouth, to close upon something real. And the idea is, yes, it's good to be open-minded. Don't jump to conclusions if you haven't looked at it. But ultimately, we do need to make decisions. We do it in life all the time, don't we? We make decisions based on what's most reasonable or what's true. The first part of the question, which mentioned why is atheism popular, was that the first part? What's so appealing about it?
I passed it back.
Well, that's all right. I think it was what's so appealing about atheism. And I think...
appealing, yeah.
I think there could be many things. It was interesting, the Dostoevsky quote, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible, is actually saying, well, if there isn't any judgment, then actually that gives me, in one sense, a great degree of freedom, because I can do whatever I like. There's going to be no ultimate accountability. And so that could be part of it. Partly, in our culture, it's just easy, isn't it? If you want to fit in, it's quite easy in my generation to say, well, God doesn't exist. It's much harder to actually make that kind of claim. I think what I want to say, though, is that people can come to conclusions for many different reasons. So I'm not wanting to say this is why every atheist is an atheist. There might be all sorts of reasons why someone is. The ultimate thing that we want to look at, though, is what's true. Because I think, and that's where even in debates with atheists, when I've done public debates, what we can agree on is this: look, we want to know what's true, and we want to look at the evidence. Yeah.
And you could counter-argument, say that atheism, could that be a crutch as well?
Yeah.
For people that don't believe. Were you saying in return that atheism is a crutch? Oh, there you are. There you are. There's the question. That people become atheists to deal with distant or abusive fathers.
What I'm not saying is that that's always the case, okay? That every atheist is just reacting against a negative experience of fathers. What I was saying is this: look, if you can argue that people just believe in God because they want to project this positive idea of fatherhood into the heavens, atheism could, in some cases, be the opposites. And Paul Witz's book is simply saying, look, here's a study of some of the famous atheists through history, and isn't it interesting that in almost every case, there's been a very negative or no experience of fatherhood in their lives. Now, that's clearly not the case, because otherwise there'd be a lot of dysfunctional families going on if every atheist was in that situation. I'm just saying that could be one reason why we might be led to that conclusion. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The Bible says God has put eternity in the hearts of men. But what is the reason for this? So that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end.
So the quote there is from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. Why has God done it? I think because the Bible reveals that God is a God who wants to be known by us and wants to know us personally. There are two words that the Bible uses in Hebrew for know. One is kind of intellectual knowledge, like the knowledge you have when you pass an exam. And the other is a personal knowledge, like you have when you meet a friend and get to know them. And it's saying that actually God's desire is that we come into this relationship of intimate knowledge. And so God has put these things in us because he wants us to find him. He wants us to relate to him. We were created for this relationship with God. And as Pascal said, if we choose to turn away from God, nothing else will fill the void. Nothing else will fill the gap. So God has done that because we work best in relationship with him. And when we aren't in relationship, there's something that niggles away at our hearts that says, hey, something's not right here. Something's missing. Yeah.
Can we really argue logically that God is real? Isn't it really about faith and personal experience?
Okay, can we prove, isn't it just about faith? Firstly, can we prove? No, we can't. Okay? Does that mean faith is irrational? No, it isn't. Why? Because proof is actually, technically speaking, something that you find very rarely. You find it in areas like pure mathematics, mathematical proofs. But in most kind of normal areas of life, if I can say that, my dad's a maths teacher, so he wouldn't like me to say that. But in most kind of everyday areas of life, we don't talk about proof. We talk about what's reasonable. You can't know it for 100% certainty, but you can know a great degree of certainty on something. That's how we work in relationships. You know, there's always a shadow of doubt, isn't there, that something might not be true. But what do? We go with the weight of the evidence. That's what scientists do all the time. They go with the weight of the evidence, the best explanation. And I would say, I don't believe in God because I have 100% proof. But I think when we look at the evidence, we see that God is actually the best explanation for the evidence we have. And in light of what we have, actually not believing in God, I think, would be a bigger leap of faith. Yeah. It would require kind of a greater assumption than it would be to believe in God. So it's not the kind of leap of faith that people talk about. It's more like a step of faith. Faith is acting upon what I'm convinced is true. It's about trust. But it's not believing in spite of evidence. And I think that's where in our culture, faith has become redefined. In fact, in one of the recent editions of a new dictionary, it has been redefined to mean belief in spite of evidence. Historically, it was never that way. And actually, we think about, the way we use faith, trust, you trust in people because you have reasons to. When people lost faith in the banks, it was because they had reasons not to. Yeah. You trust in a pilot because you believe that he has the experience to get you to the destination and so forth. So faith is never normally in spite of evidence. It's always based upon it. And I would say Christianity starts with evidence, but if it's true, like Canarik was sharing in her story, it needs to go beyond that. It needs to actually be, okay, am I going to put my life and trust in the person who I'm convinced of is true?
And it's interesting the way in which society has changed when the truth of the Gospels hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. It's just a shift that's happened. Nothing has changed, but it's become, hasn't it, the norm to actually challenge our Christian faith. Okay, how do we know God is all-loving and all-powerful when there is no one like God?
How do we know God is all-loving and all-powerful when there is no one like God? Well, in one sense, I'd say it's because there is no one like God that he is those things. If everyone was like that, then I would say, well, he's not all. He's one of many. So there's something unique about God in that sense. I think we have to be interesting question because when we talk about God, we often bring out these kind of theological terms, omniscience, omnipotence, all-knowing, all-powerful, and so forth. as if there's kind of a checklist of this is what God is like. But as I said in an earlier question, how do we know what God is like? Only if God reveals himself to us. Otherwise, how do I know my ideas about God are not just a projection that I have in my mind? And this is important because I was chatting just a couple of weeks ago, regularly chat with Muslim friends, and they say, look, God cannot be like Jesus because this is what God is like. But I want to say, well, actually, how would we know what God is like unless God has revealed himself anyway? And what we see through the Bible, and in particular through Jesus, is God's knowledge, God's power. But not in abstract terminology, but in the context of a story. And that's where it's so much more helpful. People didn't come to discover God was like this because God gave them a theological textbook, but he revealed himself through the story first of the nation of Israel and then the person of Jesus. So if you want to get to know what God is like, the best thing to do would be to read the story, to actually read one of the accounts of Jesus' life. We've got some copies next door that you can take away. And say, actually, what does the person of Jesus reveal to me? And if God is like Jesus, if God is Jesus, then what kind of God does this show me? Yeah.
And the final question, which links to that evidence, is where can I find evidence for the resurrection of Jesus?
Where can you find evidence? Well, there's this book that was written recently called But Is It True? No. Well, as I said, it is the final chapter because in one sense it's the linchpin, it's the foundation to the Christian faith. If the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, then Christianity is a sham. We should go down to the building site on Lansdowne Road tomorrow and tell all the people to stop because they're wasting their time building a new building for Lansdowne Church because we're all believing a delusion. Now, you might say that's stating it rather strongly, but that's exactly what Christians have always said. The Apostle Paul, writing in the New Testament, said, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we are more to be pitied than anyone else because we believed a lie. And if we've just hoped for Christ in this life, if there's nothing beyond, then it's a waste of time. So it's really important to look at the resurrection because that really is the foundation stone. What do we do to look at that? Very briefly, I would say we want to look at the New Testament documents because they take us right back to the first century. But we also want to look at the impact this claim made upon the early Christians through history. Why was it that strict kind of monotheistic Jews suddenly started following this crucified Messiah if it wasn't for the resurrection? What was it that caused them to totally transform their ideas about life after death and so forth back 2,000 years ago if it wasn't for the resurrection? What was it that happened to the body if it wasn't for the resurrection and so forth? And so we want to look at the evidence and then we want to say, given what we know, and what's interesting is that even amongst scholars who are not Christians, there is certain agreement about things that must have happened. Jesus must have died. The tomb was empty. The disciples were convinced that they'd met the risen Jesus. Something had happened to them. The church was based on this claim. If we're going to reject that, the resurrection, we need to come up with an alternative explanation. The other thing I'd say is that that's the very question we're going to look at next month. What a convenient question. It's almost as if Gareth deliberately put that one at the end. But seriously, next month, the week before Easter, we're going to be asking the question about the resurrection. Is it ridiculous and irrelevant? And it is such a big claim, we're going to spend a whole evening looking at that one together. So that might be really helpful too.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
Great.
That's good. Thanks very much indeed for this evening. We hope that that's given you a flavour, some of the answers that Michael's come up with. And again, as we always say, tonight is just a quick covering of answering some of the questions that you've got. Do please explore further. If you've come along to really inquire and to find out more, speak to the guys that are wearing the big questions lanyards. Speak to Michael or myself. Speak to the people that the people that you've come along with, and just take time to explore. As we said earlier on, Christianity, Jesus claimed to be God, and that is a great starting point. That's the biggest claim that's been made. So, a good starting point to actually start to explore who God is. We do run an alpha course. We've got one currently running at the moment, which gives opportunities to have those questions answered. It's coming to the end, and we have a new one starting after Easter, so there'll be more information about that. But we hope tonight that you've really enjoyed it, that it's been, it's different. The way we do church on Big Questions evening is very different, but we hope that you found it challenging, but interesting. We've got teas and coffees available for you to enjoy now. And also just to say that Michael's books are available in the church hall. They're available for sale. I think they're £5 each. All the royalties for the books go to MOE, which is the Michael Lotz Evangelist Trust. And to support Michael in all the work that he does in sharing the gospel all over Europe. So thanks again for this evening.